Wyatt McAllister, a former cavalryman who had retreated from the chaos of the world to the snow-covered Timberline Mountains, Oregon, moved cautiously through the dense forest gathering firewood before the blizzard swallowed the night. But what he saw made him freeze. Colt Remington and his canine partner Duke lay bound and unconscious in the snow. Beside them, a crumpled note bore the jagged words, "This is the end for those who don't listen." Blood seeped into the frozen ground, their shallow breaths fading against the raging wind. Who could have done this, and why leave them in the merciless cold? What unfolded next would stir the heart and restore faith in miracles. Snow blanketed Timberline, turning the small mountain town into a maze of white ridges and shadowed pines. By nightfall, the wind sharpened to a howl, sending flakes like shards of glass slicing through the dark. Timberline was a place where silence ruled, and for Wyatt, 46, it had been a refuge since leaving the cavalry. He lived in a weathered cabin miles from the nearest road, tending to his woodpile and keeping to himself. Thick boots, a worn army coat, and a knit cap kept the cold at bay, but the ghosts of past battles demanded more than clothing to keep them away. That evening, Wyatt moved through the woods with a rucksack and flashlight, the sharp scent of pine resin filling the air as each footstep cracked through the crusted snow. He knew these trails blindfolded, every fallen log, every twist of the creek. The routine was calming until the beam of his light landed on something out of place, two dark shapes lying on the snow ahead. He slowed, eyes narrowing. Not deer, not hikers. As he approached, the outlines solidified into human boots and a dog's muzzle. Wyatt's breath hissed between his teeth. Instinct took over. Check for ambush. Watch for movement. Scan the tree line. The storm muffled everything except the pounding of his pulse. The man on the ground was Colt Remington, 33, a narcotics investigator with Timberline PD. His short brown hair clung to ice patrol jacket, torn badge smeared with blood. His hands were bound behind his back, the rope digging into purpled skin. His lips were blue breaths, shallow. Beside him, Duke, a 6-year-old German shepherd, lay with ropes lashing his front and back legs, a cloth knotted over his muzzle. Even unconscious, his body angled protectively toward Colt. A faint growl rumbled in his throat as the flashlight swept over him, a spark of loyalty still alive. Pinned to a cedar trunk above them was a sheet of paper, its edges soaked with snow. "This is the end for those who don't listen." The jagged handwriting bled where melting snow had run. Wyatt recognized the message, and the meticulous knots for what they were not random cruelty, but a calculated warning. Military-style lashing, clean and efficient, executed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Wyatt crouched, pulling a combat knife from his boot. Working quickly, he cut Duke free first. The shepherd stirred weakly ears, twitching eyes, dark with pain, yet still trying to glare. "Easy, boy," Wyatt murmured. "I'm here to help." Duke's head sagged back into the snow. Wyatt moved to Colt, slicing through the ropes and freeing his arms. The man groaned once, but did not wake. Snow clung to his uniform, blood frozen at the seams. Wyatt checked his pulse. Faint, but there. Cold would kill them faster than blood loss. He glanced toward the trail. His truck sat a few hundred yards away on the old logging road. No chance to carry both at once. 2 trips would be necessary. Wyatt shrugged off his coat, draping it over Colt's torso, then lifted Duke. The dog was heavy, nearly 80 pounds, but Wyatt had carried worse under fire. Duke's head lolled against his shoulder, breathing shallow but steady. Step by step, through the snow boots sinking deep. Wyatt reached the truck. He opened the back door, laid Duke on a blanket covering him with another. The shepherd's eyes flicked open, but he made no sound, only a subtle tremor of recognition. Wyatt shut the door and jogged back to the officer. Colt lay where he had been left, snow piling on his uniform. Wyatt knelt, slid an arm under his shoulders, and lifted. Colt's head rolled against his chest lips, blowing cold. "Hold on, son," Wyatt muttered. "Not tonight." He trudged back to the truck, breath puffing in clouds. Easing Colt onto the back seat beside Duke, he adjusted the blankets to cover them both. For a moment, unconscious man and dog leaned against each other, partners even at the edge of death. Wyatt slammed the door, circled to the driver's seat, and started the engine. The heater coughed, then began to blow, taped ducting humming. Snow hissed off the hood. Headlights carved tunnels through the storm as he turned toward his cabin. In the mirror, Duke shifted closer to Colt, as if shielding him. Wyatt felt a tug in his chest, recognition of a bond forged under fire. He drove on, replaying the scene, the knots, the note, the precise cruelty. He had come to these mountains to escape the horrors of war, yet war had found him again, sprawled over the timberline snow, with blood seeping into the crust. 5 minutes later, the truck skidded to a stop beside his cabin, a low timber structure half buried in drifts smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Wyatt McAllister cut the engine, swung open the back, and lifted Duke first, cradling the dog carefully to avoid aggravating his injured limbs. Inside, he placed him on a thick blanket near the wood stove. The German shepherd stirred, nose twitching at the mingling scent of pine resin and burning logs. Wyatt turned back for Colt, lifting the officer across the threshold and setting him gently on the worn couch beside the fire. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds, maps lining the walls, snowshoes leaning in a corner. Wyatt moved swiftly, fetching towels, warm water, and his emergency first aid kit, never pausing to question why years of training compelled him to act this way. When someone's down, you pick them up. As he loosened boots, checked pulses, and wrapped blankets, he kept glancing at the window. Outside, snow continued to fall, shrouding the world in white silence. Whoever had left that note might be watching from the tree line. Wyatt tightened the door lock and set his shotgun within reach. Duke let out a weak rumble as Wyatt approached with a towel, but his eyes were calmer now. He allowed Wyatt to wipe the snow from his fur and undo the last of the knots around his hind legs. "You're a fighter," Wyatt murmured. Colt did not stir, but his breathing had deepened slightly. Blue drained from his lips as the cabin warmth wrapped around him. Wyatt draped another blanket over Colt's chest, noting the Timberline Police Department badge glinting faintly. This wasn't a random hiker. This was law enforcement, a different kind of danger. As Wyatt straightened, he caught his reflection in the dark window, a soldier who had sought solitude now standing over a wounded cop and his loyal dog. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. Whatever storm had dragged them here wasn't finished, but tonight at least they were alive, and that was enough. The fire popped, sending sparks upward while the wind moaned through the pines. Wyatt sat back on his heels, rubbing a hand over his face. In the quiet of the cabin, 3 heartbeats his own, the officer's, and the dog's formed a fragile rhythm against the storm. Outside, snowflakes pressed against the window like 1,000 white moths. Timberline's storm hadn't let up yet inside Wyatt McAllister's cabin. A circle of faint warmth flickered from the wood stove. Wyatt moved with practiced efficiency, his training resurfacing. He had carried Colt and Duke here just minutes ago, and every instinct screamed that time was precious. The smell of wet wool, coppery blood, and pine resin clung to the air. Wyatt shed his coat and gloves, rolling up sleeves over strong forearms. Movements calm but precise, the same tempo he had used treating soldiers under fire. He knelt beside Colt Remington, checking the pulse again. The officer was 33, lean but solidly built, a Timberline PD narcotics investigator with short brown hair matted against his forehead. He lay pale and shivering on the old couch, eyes closed, uniform torn and wet. Wyatt unbuttoned the bleeding jacket. He lit another log in the stove until flames roared, sending warmth through the room. He turned to Duke, 6 years old now, lying on a thick blanket by the hearth sable, and black coat slick with melting snow rope, still half tight around his hind legs. "Easy boy," Wyatt murmured, snipping away the remaining knots. The shepherd trembled, but lifted his head. Dark eyes locked on Colt, as if still guarding him. Wyatt fetched a kettle of water and roughly chopped ginger, tossing it into the pot set over the stove. The sharp scent filled the cabin bright and clean. A knock rattled the door, barely audible over the storm. Wyatt tensed, shotgun within reach. Few visitors ventured here unannounced. Crossing the cabin in 3 strides, he peered through the peephole and relaxed. Standing on the porch was May Whitlow, a local wildlife volunteer in her late 20s. Slender but strong from years of hiking. The preserve, her long chestnut hair braided under a wool cap green parka, dusted with snow clinging to her shoulders. A canvas satchel bulged with jars and bandages. May had been bringing Wyatt surplus feed for birds and small game since discovering his cabin on patrols. Wyatt opened the door, gesturing her in. She stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots, cheeks flushed from cold. "You didn't answer your radio," she said, voice firm yet warm. "Figured you'd be here." Her gaze fell on the scene, the unconscious officer, the wounded dog by the fire. Wyatt crouched between them. She froze momentarily, but did not panic. "Help me with the dog," Wyatt said simply. May set down her satchel and knelt. "What happened?" "Found them in the woods, tied up." Wyatt nodded, already unwrapping a roll of gauze. "We need to stop the bleeding and get some warmth into them." May Whitlow opened her bag, revealing small jars labeled with handwritten notes, comfrey salve calendula oil, and powdered herbs. She had grown up around Timberline, learning old remedies from her grandmother while volunteering at the local rescue shelter. She wasn't a licensed vet, but she had treated enough injured animals to know exactly what she was doing. Slipping off her mittens, she touched Duke's flank gently. The shepherd's ears flicked, and he let out a low growl, eyes never leaving Colt. "It's okay, hero," she murmured. "I'm here to help you." Wyatt watched, noting how Duke's gaze stayed locked on his handler. Even with his hind leg trembling, Duke shifted to face Colt, refusing to lie completely flat until he could see the officer's face. The dog's loyalty was like an invisible cord stretching across the cabin, binding them together. May examined the wound on Duke's leg, a bullet graze inflamed but not catastrophic, and began mixing powdered herbs with warm water. She applied the poultice and wrapped it in a clean bandage while Wyatt held the dog steady. On the couch, Colt stirred faintly. Wyatt dipped a cloth in the hot ginger water and dabbed it across Colt's lips. The warmth of the cabin and the scent of ginger began to lift the edge of cold from his skin. Wyatt spoke without looking up. "He's a cop." May's eyes flicked up. "Found him and the dog dumped in the snow, that canine unit." She reached toward Duke's collar and turned the brass plate over. "This is a special operations tag," she whispered. "He's done big work. No wonder he's so alert." Wyatt fetched another towel and began cleaning Colt's shoulder wound. The bleeding slowed under pressure. He noticed a faint scar along Colt's temple and wondered what kind of cases had led him into these woods. May handed him a jar of salve. "This will cut the risk of infection," she said softly. Wyatt smeared it gently along the torn skin before rebandaging. Minutes stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire, the kettle steaming, and Duke's labored breathing. May brushed melted snow from the dog's muzzle. "You've seen this before," she said quietly. Wyatt nodded. "Too many times." He set the kettle aside and poured some of the hot ginger water into a mug. May helped tilt Colt's head just enough to trickle a few drops onto his tongue. The officer's throat moved in a reflexive swallow. Outside, the storm still hammered the cabin, but inside the air thickened with wood-smoke herbs and a fragile sense of safety. When they finished dressing, the wounds Wyatt pulled a low stool near the couch and sat, hands resting on his knees. May sat opposite him by the fire, watching Duke's eyes flutter but never leave Colt. She reached out and scratched behind the shepherd's uninjured ear. "He's remarkable," she said softly. "Most dogs would have shut down by now." Wyatt studied Duke's face, the silver threading through his muzzle, the faint scar over his right eye. "He's more than remarkable," Wyatt said. "He's the reason that man is still alive." Colt shifted slightly, a weak sound escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. Wyatt placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. May began tidying her satchel, but left a jar of salve and clean bandages beside the hearth. She looked around the cabin maps on the walls, old service medals in a small frame, and her gaze softened. "You didn't call anyone?" she asked. Wyatt shook his head. "No reception, and I don't know who to trust yet." May studied him for a moment. She had always suspected there was more to Wyatt's quiet life than chopping wood and feeding birds. Now she saw the truth in his eyes, alert, scanning soldier sharp. She rose and adjusted her parka. "I'll check back tomorrow," she said. "Keep them warm, especially the dog. He'll need fluids." Wyatt shook his head. "Not just yet." "Thank you." Before she left, May crouched beside Duke again. "You're a hero," she whispered. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the blanket eyes, flicking once more toward Colt before closing. May stood, hoisted her satchel, and slipped out into the snowstorm, leaving a gust of cold air swirling behind her. Wyatt watched the door close, then turned back to his two unexpected guests. He laid another log on the fire, sat back, and exhaled slowly. The cabin had always been a place for silence, but tonight it had become a lifeboat. He reached over, resting a hand lightly on Duke's bandaged leg. The shepherd twitched but didn't pull away. The bond in the room felt palpable. A soldier, a wounded cop, and a loyal dog refusing to abandon his partner even at the edge of death. Wyatt leaned back in his chair. Outside the storm roared, but inside the circle of warmth, held steady. Whatever story had led Colt and Duke into the woods had brought them to him, and Wyatt, though unaware, was already stepping into their fight. The storm outside had thinned to a soft hiss, but the cabin still smelled of wet fir herbs and smoldering pine. The fire burned low, casting an amber glow over the worn wood floors. Wyatt McAllister sat in his chair near the window, boots planted firmly, shotgun propped within reach. Hours had passed since May left, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin and the slow breathing of his two charges. The creak of the cabin and the slow, steady breathing of the man and dog he had rescued filled the quiet. On the couch, Colt Remington shifted under the blankets. He was 33, his face still pale beneath the stubble, and Bruce's short brown hair damp from melted ice. The Timberline PD badge lay on the table beside him, where Wyatt had placed it earlier. His fingers twitched, as if reaching for something, then curled back against the couch. By the fire, Duke, the 6-year-old German shepherd, stirred as well, lifting his head slightly before settling back on his paws. Colt's eyes fluttered open, clouded with confusion. He blinked at the low ceiling, the maps on the walls, the warm glow of the fire. A tremor ran through his hands as he tried to sit, wincing, clutching at his side. His gaze darted around, searching. "My phone," he rasped. "Where's my phone?" Wyatt leaned forward. "Easy. You're safe now." He poured a cup of lukewarm ginger water and held it out. "Drink first." Colt ignored the cup eyes, frantic. "No. My phone." "It had everything on it," he whispered, trying to swing his legs off the couch only to collapse back against the cushions. Wyatt placed the cup on the table, voice calm. "You were half dead in the snow. You didn't have a phone when I found you." Colt's throat worked, closing his eyes briefly, then opening again as the words spilled out. "I was tracking them," he whispered. "The Iron Hawks," his voice cracking at the name. "Months of undercover work gathering video contacts following routes. I had it all. They grabbed me 2 nights ago," he continued. He coughed, wincing. "They took turns, questions, fists, boots, wanted my files. I wouldn't give them the passcode. Then they tied me and Duke up and dumped us in the woods like trash." The words hung heavy in the cabin's warmth. Wyatt studied the man on the couch. This was no careless patrol officer. This was someone who had walked into a hornet's nest alone. He reached for the mug again and pressed it into Colt's hands. This time Colt drank throat-moving with small, careful swallows. Duke's ears flicked at the sound of his handler's voice. The dog shifted wind low, then pushed himself upright on his bandaged legs, limping toward the couch. He rested his head on Colt's lap and licked his hand. Colt's fingers trembled as they curled into the shepherd's fur. "Good boy," he murmured, eyes glistening. "You didn't leave me?" Wyatt watched the exchange, a flicker of something human softening his face. He had seen soldiers come back from death because a comrade refused to let them go. The bond between officer and dog was the same, quiet, unbreakable, forged under fire. Colt rubbed Duke's neck, the dog's tail thumping weakly against the couch. "They thought we'd freeze out there," Colt said. "They underestimated him. He dragged me as far as he could before collapsing." He inhaled shakily. "My phone." Colt began again, but Wyatt cut him off gently. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Right now you need rest. And a plan. You're not alone anymore." He sat back, arms folded. "Tell me about these Iron Hawks." Colt's eyes flicked to the window, then back. "They're not just moving meth or fentanyl. They're running guns too, using the old Forest Service roads. Someone in the department feeds them intel patrol schedules, raid times. Every time we get close evidence, disappears." He pressed a hand to his bandaged ribs. "I went out near the canyon bend following a tip. Should have called for backup." He glanced at Duke. "We're used to working alone." Duke shifted again, eyes locked on his handler, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The dog's presence seemed to anchor Colt to the room, keeping panic at bay. Wyatt leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And now they know you're alive," he said quietly. "That changes the board." Colt closed his eyes, then opened them, a flicker of shame passing over his face. "I didn't think anyone would find us," he admitted. "If you hadn't been here—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. Wyatt stood and moved to the small counter where May had left her jars and bandages. He poured more ginger water, mixing in a few drops of honey. "Drink this," he said, handing it over. "It'll help with the shakes." Colt took it, hands steadier now. Duke lay down beside the couch head, still resting on Colt's knee. Minutes passed in the crackling warmth. Colt spoke again, softer now, telling fragments of the story. How the cartel leader called himself Jed Polk. How recruits were branded with a hawk tattoo. How he'd almost escaped 3 weeks ago but stayed to finish the case. Wyatt listened intently, absorbing every detail. Without interrupting, Wyatt kept listening, storing every detail like coordinates on a map. When Colt paused, he said, "You're not going back out there tonight, and neither is Duke." Colt nodded toward Duke. "You both need time." Wyatt crossed to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. Snow still fell lighter now, drifting like ash. The forest beyond looked almost serene, yet Wyatt's instincts hummed. Danger was coiled just beyond sight. Colt shifted under the blanket, eyelids heavy. "Why did you help us?" he asked, voice drowsy. Wyatt kept his eyes on the tree line. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "And I've seen what happens when nobody does." Duke's eyes followed Wyatt, then returned to his handler. He let out a soft whine, licking Colt's fingers again. Colt managed a faint smile, a ghost of expression through the bruises. "We're not done," he whispered to the dog. "Not yet." Wyatt turned back, studying the two of them, a wounded cop clutching the fur of his loyal partner, a German shepherd, refusing to give up. In the firelight, they looked less like victims, and more like survivors of a battle still unfolding. Outside, the storm eased into mist, blanketing trees in silver. Inside, the cabin's warmth held, but Wyatt knew this was only a pause. He walked to the stove, added another log, and watched the flames flare. "Rest," he said, voice low. "Tomorrow we figure the next move." Colt's eyes closed at last. Hands still tangled in Duke's fur. The dog's breathing slow and steady. Wyatt sat back in his chair, the old habit of keeping watch settling over him again. The night stretched ahead quiet, but charged a fragile harbor against a tide he could already feel rising. Morning came to Timberline as a thin, colorless light bled through mist. The storm had quieted overnight, leaving a world covered in glittering frost. Wyatt McAllister stood on his porch boots planted firmly in the snow, scanning the tree line. The soldier's instinct never truly slept. Even now his eyes tracked every shift in shadow. Behind him, inside the cabin, Colt stirred on the couch, bruised body wrapped in bandages, but more alert than the night before. Near the hearth, Duke slowly pushed himself to his feet, the bandaged hind leg trembling but holding his weight. Wyatt re-entered the cabin. The Colt was already trying to sit upright, pale but determined. "You're pushing it," Wyatt warned. Colt exhaled sharply. "We don't have time. They'll think we're dead, but not for long. We need to see what's left out there." Wyatt glanced at Duke, who limped closer to his handler, ears perked despite the injury. Colt swung his legs off the couch. "If I can stand, I can work." He still wore torn patrol pants, but had changed into a flannel shirt Wyatt found in a storage box, sleeves rolled slightly oversized. The sight made him look less like a cop and more like a man trying to survive. Wyatt handed him a steaming mug of ginger water. "Finish this first. We're not moving until you've got some heat inside you." Colt obeyed with a grimace. By late morning, they set out behind the cabin where Wyatt had first brought the truck through. The snow was crusted boots, breaking it with sharp sounds. Duke limped at Colt's side, nose low to the ground, coat brushed clean but still dull from exhaustion. His breath steamed in the cold tail, stiff but determined. They began at the area where Wyatt had found them 2 nights earlier. Snow had covered most signs, but Wyatt's training read the terrain like a map. "Look here," he said, pointing to a shallow depression. "Footprint, large boot, maybe size 11. Deep heel drag, someone carrying weight." Colt crouched, despite the ache in his ribs. Could be when they dumped us. His fingers brushed a scrap of duct tape half buried in ice. He held it up. This kind, Wyatt said quietly. They used to seal crates. Duke sniffed the air, ears flicking. He patted a few steps off the trail and began pawing at a drift. Wyatt followed and found a small fragment of torn, stiff cloth. Colt leaned in. The fabric smelled faintly chemical sharp and sour. Cutting agent, Colt muttered. They'd been handling product. The shepherd sneezed, giving a low bark, staring down the line of trees as if the scent continued. Wyatt slipped the cloth into a plastic bag from his coat pocket. "Good boy," he said, ruffling Duke's ear. The dog's tail thumped once, then stilled. Colt rested a hand on his partner's neck. "He's onto something," he murmured. Back at the cabin later that afternoon, May Whitlow arrived again. Her green parka frosted with snowflakes, chestnut braid, swinging over one shoulder, carrying a thermos and a small notepad. She dropped her satchel near the door. "I brought some broth for the dog," she said, kneeling to set it down. Then she looked at Colt. "You look better upright, but you shouldn't be on your feet yet." Colt gave a faint smile. "Thanks for yesterday." "I owe you nothing." May Whitlow waved it off. "Just doing what I do. And I've got something you might want to hear." She pulled her notepad from her coat pocket. "For the past month, I've seen trucks, sometimes 3, passing through the northern edge of the preserve between midnight and 3. Old service roads not on any map. No logging permit, no wildlife tags." She tapped the page, "Big rigs. Not local delivery." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. "Where?" She pointed to a sketched outline of the timber roads in her notebook. "Here near the ridge trail. They've left ruts and oil stains. Last night coming back from your place, I saw fresh tracks. One truck turned toward town." Colt glanced at Duke. The shepherd's ears pricked at the sound of her voice. "That's our road," Colt said. "They're moving product through the preserve and into Timberline before dispersing it." He looked at May. "You've been risking a lot watching them. Someone has to. I don't like seeing these mountains treated like a highway for poison." She reached down to pour the broth into a bowl for Duke. The dog sniffed. It lapped slowly, then rose and padded to the open door. Nose twitching, ears forward. Wyatt followed his gaze. "He's marking something," he said. Duke stepped onto the porch, sniffed the air, then limped toward the tree line. Tail stiff, body low. The dog stopped, pawed at the ground, and looked back at them, an unmistakable signal. Colt's voice dropped. "He's telling us which way." He stepped onto the porch, pulling his jacket tighter. "That's toward the ridge trail May mentioned." Wyatt grabbed his coat and followed. May zipped her parka, tucking her braid into her scarf. "I'm coming too," she said. They walked a few yards into the snow until Duke stopped beside a faint track half hidden under frost. Wyatt crouched, brushing away the snow to reveal tire imprints and a thin scatter of crystalline powder. He rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, sniffed and grimaced. "Chemical residue," he said. "Same smell as the cloth fragment." Colt crouched next to him, breath fogging. "They were here less than 12 hours ago. You can see where the snow hasn't settled." Duke's tail flicked. He pawed twice in the direction of the old service road leading toward Timberline. May hugged herself against the cold eyes wide. "He's like a compass," she said softly. Colt rested a hand on the dog's back. "He's always been like that," he said. "Even hurt, he wouldn't quit." They gathered evidence photographing the tire tracks with Wyatt's old field camera, sealing the cloth fragment and sketching the terrain. Colt's hands shook as he wrote notes in May's notepad. Wyatt kept watch on the tree line the entire time, scanning for movement. The mist curling between the trees seemed thicker now, shadows bending as though something moved beyond them. When they returned to the cabin near dusk, the fire had burned low. Wyatt tossed in more logs and closed the door behind them. Duke curled by the stove, ears still angled toward the window. Colt collapsed back onto the couch, pale but satisfied. "We've got our first trail," he said. May sat at the table, flipping through her notepad again. "I'll keep checking the ridge trail tonight," she offered. Wyatt shook his head. "Not alone. Not with what's out there." Colt looked at Wyatt. "We'll need a plan, but at least now we know where to start." He reached down to scratch Duke's neck. The shepherd leaned into his hand, eyes half closed, but still watchful. Wyatt studied them both, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper. Outside, the mist swallowed the last light of day. Inside, the three of them gathered around the fire, an ex-soldier, an injured cop, and a steadfast dog bound now by evidence and danger alike. The traces of the enemy were no longer a mystery. They formed a trail cutting straight toward Timberline. A thin winter sun rose over the town, the sky washed in pale blue and silver mist. The storm had broken, but frost clung to every surface, and the air still smelled of pine and cold iron. Inside the cabin, Wyatt watched Colt pull on a heavier jacket borrowed from his closet. His bruises had faded only slightly. Ribs still bandaged beneath the shirt, but his eyes were sharper now. He had the look of a man who had decided to stop running from the nightmare and walk straight into it. Wyatt adjusted the strap on a worn leather satchel he carried across his shoulders, salt and pepper hair tucked under a navy beanie. May Whitlow stood near the door, fastening her parka, the green fabric patched at the elbows from years of mountain patrol. She was only 28, but had the steady hands and clear eyes of someone who had seen the quiet brutality of poaching and trafficking in the backcountry. Today she wore dark jeans, boots lined with shearling, and a canvas messenger bag bulging with folded maps. On the rug near the hearth, Duke lay stretched on his blanket. The German shepherd's bandaged hind leg was starting to heal, though his gait remained uneven. A small black camera, barely larger than a matchbox, had been attached to his collar by May, the night before, its tiny lens catching the firelight. Duke tilted his head as if sensing the plan forming above him. Colt crouched, pressing his forehead to the dog. "You stay here and watch the fort," he whispered. "We'll be back." Duke let out a low whine, nudging his handler's handtail, sweeping the floor once. Wyatt locked the cabin door behind them. "We move quiet," he said. "Stay off main roads until we're inside town." May nodded. "I know a shortcut down the South Ridge Trail," she said, leading them through the trees. Snow crunched underfoot branches, shedding frost as the rising sun warmed them. Timberline lay nestled in the valley streets, lined with false front buildings from the logging days and newer concrete blocks housing the police department and post office. Colt pulled his hood up as they approached. He looked less like a cop and more like a hunter heading to a gear shop. Wyatt walked with an easy stride, scanning every corner. May slipped into the local coffee shop first, buying 3 cups to make their presence seem casual. They settled at a window table. Colt produced a small notepad and sketched a rough plan of the town's grid marking known drop points. "We're looking for any sign of the Iron Hawk's distribution," he said softly. "Warehouses, trucks, or unusual patrol shifts." Wyatt sipped his coffee. "You think someone in your department's moving the pieces?" Colt's mouth tightened. "I'm sure of it, just not who yet." They split up to gather information. May headed to the town supply depot, posing as a volunteer, requesting old manifests. Wyatt drifted toward the hardware store where truckers often stopped. Colt, pulling a beanie low over his brow, crossed the street to a pawn shop rumored to fence stolen goods. Each moved separately, but stayed within sight of one another when possible. Back at the cabin, Duke lifted his head from the blanket. The small camera on his collar blinked red, transmitting to a battered laptop Wyatt had set up before leaving. Duke stood and began patrolling the cabin's perimeter, nose low, tail stiff. The snow held tiny scents only he could parse. By the woodshed he froze, sniffed hard, and pawed at a mound of snow. Beneath it lay a small black nylon bag. He clawed it free, teeth catching the strap, and dragged it toward the porch. Inside later inspection would reveal a set of SIM cards sealed in plastic and a flash drive smeared with mud, the kind of evidence men toss away when they think they're untouchable. In town, Wyatt caught sight of a familiar figure outside the police station, a tall man in his 40s, blonde hair, slicked back, neatly trimmed mustache. Lieutenant Silas Boone Timberline, PD's operations supervisor. He wore a dark patrol jacket over a pressed shirt and tie-polished boots, crunching on salt. Boone had a reputation for charm at community meetings, but was harsh with subordinates. Colt, watching from across the street, stiffened. He shouldn't be off shift, he muttered under his breath. May returned from the depot, a thin smile on her lips. "Old manifests," she whispered, sliding a folded paper into Colt's hand. 3 unmarked trucks had made runs through the preserve last week. "Guess who signed the access permits?" Colt unfolded the paper. Boone's name appeared at the bottom of each permit. They regrouped in a corner of the public library, spreading papers on a wooden table between stacks of books. Wyatt kept one eye on the door, the other on the notes. "This is your guy?" he asked. Colt tapped the signatures. "He's high enough to reroute patrols, bury evidence, and sign off on service road clearances. This is how the Iron Hawks keep moving." May frowned. "He's smart. If he senses we're onto him, he'll shut everything down." Colt exhaled. "Then we need proof stronger than this." Back at the cabin that evening, the snow reflected a bruised violet sky. Duke limped to greet them, tail wagging stiffly. Colt crouched, hugging the dog's neck. Then he noticed the nylon bag on the porch. "What have you got there, partner?" He opened it, eyes widening at the sealed SIM cards and mud-smeared flash drive. "He found what they dumped?" he murmured. May crouched beside him. "Smart dog," she said softly. "Smarter than most people." Wyatt fetched a flashlight and inspected the bag. "Chemical residue," he said, holding up his fingers. "Same smell as the cloth scrap." Colt placed a hand on Duke's back. "You just gave us a fighting chance," he whispered. The dog's ears flicked, eyes still bright, despite the bandage on his leg. They gathered around the table inside, spreading the new evidence next to May's manifests. Colt inserted one of the SIM cards into a spare phone. A list of numbers appeared, some local, some tracing to burner lines. "This ties back to the warehouse near the river," he said. "If we can connect Boone's signature to these numbers." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Then you've got him cold." May poured tea for everyone, hands steady, despite the tension. She'd grown up in Timberline, watching the town change from a sleepy logging hub to a gateway for trafficking. "I always wondered why the trucks came and went without being stopped," she said quietly. "Now I know." Colt leaned back, exhaustion on his face, but determination in his eyes. "Tomorrow we move on this," he said. "Tonight we secure what we've got." Wyatt set his shotgun near the door, checked the locks, and stoked the fire again. Duke curled under the table, head resting on Colt's boot, the camera light still blinking softly like a sentinel. Outside, the mist thickened, curling against the windows. Inside, the three of them formed a quiet triangle of purpose. An ex-soldier, a wildlife volunteer, and an injured cop with a dog who refused to quit holding the missing piece of the puzzle. Timberline's shadows were no longer faceless. They had names, permits, and now evidence. Night draped Timberline in silver and ash, the mist thickening into a dense veil that muffled every sound. Inside the cabin, Wyatt McAllister, Colt Remington, and May Whitlow sat around the wooden table sorting the evidence Duke had unearthed. The stove's glow cast trembling shadows against the walls. Duke lay on his blanket, eyes half closed, ears twitching to every crack outside. His bandaged leg trembled as he shifted, but his gaze stayed locked on the door as if he could see through it. Wyatt's instincts wouldn't quiet. He had placed his shotgun within arm's reach and kept scanning the windows. Colt had dozed briefly in a chair, but when Duke's head snapped up, he stirred awake. May, seated near the hearth, stopped mid-sentence. "What is it?" she whispered. Duke gave a low, rolling growl deep in his chest, a sound no house dog made. His nose wrinkled, staring toward the northern wall. Wyatt moved silently to the window, pulling back the curtain a sliver. The mist caught a glimpse of movement between the pines. Shadows fanned out in a semicircle around the cabin. He whispered without turning. "They're here." Colt pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain in his ribs. May's eyes widened, but she stayed calm. "Iron hawks," she mouthed. Wyatt nodded once, already moving toward a locked chest in the corner. He flipped it open to reveal a tangle of military surplus tripwires, flares, 2 smoke grenades, a length of paracord. He grabbed a bundle of small metal stakes and stuffed them into his coat pockets. "We've got minutes," he said. "Colt, load the shotgun. May, kill the lamps." The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the dull orange glow of the fire. Outside, boots crunched over the snow. Wyatt slipped out the back door, breath pluming white, and began laying thin wires between tree trunks and over brush. These weren't explosive booby traps, he no longer had that hardware, but noisemakers and trip lines that would slow or confuse anyone moving through. Years of soldiering had taught him how to shape a battlefield, even with scraps. Colt crouched at a window with the shotgun braced, scanning the tree line. May crawled across the floor to grab a radio whispering coordinates to a trusted ranger friend she hoped could call for backup. Duke rose slowly, legs stiff, but body quivering with tension. He limped to the back door and pressed his nose to the crack. Then he turned and nudged Wyatt's thigh, whining softly, before moving toward a darker corner of the cabin. Wyatt followed his gaze and froze. Near a stack of firewood outside, partly hidden under snow, a faint metallic glint caught his eye. Duke pawed at the door urgently. Wyatt crouched, eyes narrowing. It wasn't junk metal, it was a pressure plate. He motioned sharply to Colt to stay back. Moving carefully, he reached for a long branch and extended it toward the patch of snow. A faint click answered the telltale tremor of a trigger. Wyatt's heart jolted. "Homemade mine," he breathed, "tripwired to blow as we come out." Duke gave a low growl, tail stiff, stepping back. The dog's warning had saved them by seconds. Wyatt traced the wire to a crude battery pack hidden beneath a fallen branch. He snipped it clean with a multi-tool, then eased back to the door. "Clear," he whispered. Colt exhaled, wiping a bead of sweat despite the cold. "He just saved our lives," he murmured, looking at Duke with renewed awe. The Iron Hawks were closing in. Dark figures moved between the trees, 6, maybe 8 men dressed in patchwork winter gear rifles slung low. One of them crept toward the back porch, unaware of the tripwire Wyatt had strung between 2 fence posts. His boot snagged the wire, yanking a cluster of tin cans into a clattering cascade. The sound shattered the quiet, and Wyatt fired a warning shot into the air. The man dove sideways. Another cursed loudly. Confusion rippled through their line. Colt took position at the side window, shotgun braced against the frame. "I've got eyes on two," he whispered. May crouched beside the table, clutching a flare. Wyatt slipped through the back again, flanking along the cabin's shadow. Duke limped behind him, despite his injury nose low tracking scents through the swirling mist. Wyatt gestured to the shepherd, then tore through the dense brush where one attacker had taken cover. Duke crept forward, silent as smoke. The dog's training showed even through pain, body low, paws precise. He vanished into the brush. Then a muffled yelp came from the man. "Get it off!" the attacker cried. Wyatt lunged forward, rifle butt, slamming into the man's shoulder, knocking the weapon loose. He pinned him to the ground, zip-tying his wrists with a cord from his pocket. Inside, Colt fired a controlled shot at a tree trunk inches from another attacker's head, forcing him to duck and retreat. May ignited the flare and tossed it toward the tree line, bathing the snow in eerie red light. Shadows lurched and scrambled, unsure how many defenders they faced. Wyatt dragged the captured man toward the cabin, Duke limping beside him, but still growling eyes bright. Inside, Wyatt ordered, shoving the man through the door. Colt covered them, shotgun raised, as May kicked the door shut and dropped the bar across it. The prisoner was mid-30s, wiry, with a hawk tattoo curling down his neck. He wore a patched camouflage jacket and fingerless gloves, mud and snow streaked on his boots. His eyes darted around the cabin, calculating. Wyatt pushed him onto a chair and tied him down. "Who sent you?" he asked quietly. The man spat on the floor but said nothing. Colt leaned on the table ribs, aching, staring at him coldly. "You know who we are." "You know what we're holding," Wyatt said. "Start talking." Outside, the remaining attackers regrouped but held their distance. They hadn't expected resistance, much less an ex-soldier turning the woods into a trap. Duke sank to his haunches, breathing hard but still staring at the door. His tail flicked once, signaling he was ready despite the pain. Wyatt crouched beside the dog hand on his neck. "You did good," he murmured. "Real good." He glanced at Colt. "We bought some time. Question is how we use it." Colt looked at the captured man. "He's our first link to Boone and the rest. We'll get what we need." May moved quietly around the cabin, dousing the firelight just enough to keep them hidden. She fetched another bandage for Duke's leg-whispering praise as she worked. The dog's eyes softened at her touch, but never left the prisoner. For the next hour, silence pressed against the cabin walls. Snow whispered against the windows. Somewhere in the trees, men muttered, waiting for orders. But inside, the trio and their canine ally had shifted the game. The Iron Hawks had come to erase witnesses. Instead, they had lost a man and their element of surprise. Wyatt studied the prisoner's face, his own lined and unreadable. Colt sat across from them, jaw tight, hand resting on Duke's back. May kept watch at the window, flare gun ready. The cabin smelled of adrenaline and gun oil, but also ginger tea and pine smoke, a strange collision of war and home. Outside, the forest settled into stillness again. For now, the traps held. Inside, they had a breathing captive, a living witness, and a dog who had once more proved himself more than just a companion. He was their edge, their early warning, their shield. Wyatt exhaled slowly, eyes meeting Colt's. "Tonight, we held the line," he said quietly. Colt's hand tightened on Duke's fur. "Thanks to him," he whispered. Duke closed his eyes, tail thumping once more, the smallest gesture of triumph. Dawn broke over Timberline in a gray wash mist, still clinging to the tree line like damp wool. The cabin stood silent, except for the crackle of the fire and the faint hiss of boiling water. Inside, Wyatt McAllister sat at the wooden table opposite the man they had captured during the night's ambush. The prisoner was bound to a chair with heavy cord, his camouflage jacket stained with melted snow and a streak of dried blood across his cheek. Mid-30s, wiry, the hawk tattoo on his neck glaring under the low light. His eyes were bloodshot, but calculating, darting between Wyatt and Colt, as if measuring escape odds. Colt, still bandaged, but more alert than the day before, leaned forward. His short brown hair damp from a hurried wash, Timberline PD badge on the table, a silent reminder of his authority. "You've got one chance to make it easier on yourself. Tell us who's running the Ironhawks and who in my department is feeding you." The man shifted fingers, twitching against the cord. "I don't know what you're talking about." Colt's eyes hardened. "Then I hand you to the feds. You'll disappear into a hole and nobody will hear you scream." Wyatt watched the exchange with a soldier's patience. He poured coffee into a tin mug and set it just out of the prisoner's reach. "Names," he said softly. The man's jaw flexed. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, something in his expression changing. "Kane," he muttered. "Names. Kane Miller. He's the one running this side of the mountains. He's got a network through the rail yard and the preserve road." Colt glanced at Wyatt. "Kane Miller," he repeated. And inside Timberline PD, the man hesitated longer this time, eyes flicking to the window where Duke lay stretched on his blanket, ears pricked toward the sound of his handler's voice. "Lieutenant Silas Boone," the prisoner said at last. "He clears the roads, changes patrol schedules, makes sure no one's looking when the trucks move." Silence filled the cabin. May, who had been tending a pot of herbal water by the stove, looked up sharply. Her green parka hung open, revealing a denim shirt patched at the elbows. "I knew it," she whispered. Colt leaned back, rubbing his ribs. "We've got him," he said quietly. On the table lay the SIM cards and flash drive Duke had discovered. Colt picked up one of the SIM cards and slotted it into a spare phone Wyatt had rigged with a secure connection. "I'm sending these to someone I trust," he said. "An old friend from the Bureau." He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name, Amos Thatcher, mid-40s, a former FBI investigator now working deep cover. Amos was a tall black man with a square jaw and eyes that saw through lies. He had once saved Colt's life during a joint task force operation. Colt composed a short, encrypted message and attached the data from the SIM cards. "If anyone can authenticate and trace this without alerting Boone, it's Thatcher," he murmured. The phone's screen blinked. Message sent. Wyatt rose, stretching his shoulders. "That's done. Now we handle the dog." He looked at May. She nodded. "I'll take him to my clinic," she said. "It's off-grid, nobody knows it's mine. I can stitch the wound properly." She fetched a heavy wool blanket and knelt beside Duke, stroking his neck. "Come on, hero," she said softly. Duke stood shakily bandaged, leg trembling, but eyes bright. May slipped a leather lead around his collar and coaxed him toward the door. Colt crouched, wincing at his ribs. "Be a good partner," he said softly, running a hand over the shepherd's ears. "He'll be back soon." Duke pressed his head against Colt's palm for a moment, tail-thumping once, then limped after May into the mist. The drive to her hidden clinic was only 15 minutes, but it felt longer. May owned an old barn tucked behind a row of cedars at the preserve's edge, renovated with stainless steel tables, old veterinary equipment, and cabinets of herbs. She had inherited it from her grandmother, who had once tended wildlife here before the county shut it down. Now it served as May's unofficial rescue center. She led Duke inside, where the air smelled of antiseptic and pine shavings. She prepared a mild sedative, speaking softly to him as she injected near his shoulder. "Just a little nap," she murmured. Duke blinked slowly, body easing, ears still flicking. Even drowsy when May put Colt's voice on speakerphone for reassurance, Duke's ears twitched toward the sound, a faint whine escaping his throat. May smiled at the loyalty. "He's listening," she told Colt over the line. "He knows you're there." Back at the cabin, Wyatt and Colt secured the prisoner in a corner using an old closet reinforced with a steel bar. Colt sat at the table rubbing his temples. "Boone's been feeding them everything he said. Roots operations my location. This explains why every bust went sideways." Wyatt leaned against the wall, arms folded. "Then we take this to the feds," he said. "Let them cut off the head." Colt shook his head slowly. "Not yet. If Boone gets wind of this, he'll vanish. We need to let Thatcher work the files first." He glanced at the phone again, then out the window. "Duke will be okay." Wyatt nodded once. "May knows what she's doing." The two men sat in silence, the weight of what they'd learned pressing down heavier than the mountain's snow. At the clinic, May finished stitching Duke's wound with neat, sure hands. She wrapped the leg in a fresh bandage and placed a heated blanket over his body. The shepherd sighed in his sleep, chest rising and falling with even rhythm. May dialed Colt's phone. "He's stable," she said. "No infection, clean stitches. He'll limp for a while, but he's tough." Colt's voice over the line softened relief, threading through the static. "Thank you," he said simply. May set the phone beside Duke's head. The dog's ears flicked once more at the sound of his handler's voice, even under sedation. May brushed her hand over his fur. "You've got a loyal one," she whispered to no one in particular. Back at the cabin, the prisoner had begun to talk, more spurred by the promise of leniency, and perhaps by Wyatt's unblinking stare. He described routes times and storage points, naming contacts in the Iron Hawks network. Colt wrote everything down, hand moving steadily despite his aching ribs. Wyatt stood by the window, eyes on the distant ridge where mists rolled like slow smoke. Night returned to Timberline Valley, mist glowing under weak moonlight. May stayed late at the clinic, keeping watch over Duke until his breathing deepened into steady sleep. Colt sat with Wyatt at the table maps spread between them, names and dates circled in red. The captured man sat slumped in the corner, realizing perhaps too late that the tide had turned. As the hour grew late, Wyatt added another log to the fire. "Now we know," he said quietly. Colt nodded, glancing at Duke's empty blanket near the hearth. Outside, the woods whispered with snow sliding off branches, but inside the cabin the battle lines had shifted. The trafficker had a name, and the plan to bring him down had begun. Snow drifted in pale sheets over Timberline Valley as the night deepened, muffling the town and the old industrial quarter where the Iron Hawks kept their warehouse. The FBI convoy crawled along a side road under cover of darkness, matte black SUVs whose headlights had been switched off. Inside one of them sat Special Agent Amos Thatcher, tall and broad-shouldered, with his usual 5 o'clock shadow, brown eyes fixed on the tactical map spread across his knees. He wore a reinforced winter vest over a dark sweater jeans tucked into heavy boots. Thatcher had worked in federal law enforcement for nearly 2 decades, and though his voice was calm, his presence radiated coiled tension. Next to him in the back seat sat Colt, ribs tightly bandaged, but face-clear eyes burning with quiet urgency. Beside him, Wyatt leaned forward, gloved hands clasped together. Wyatt wore his old field jacket patches, removed a silent nod to the soldier he once was. May rode up front with a tactical liaison from the Bureau, a woman in her early 30s named Eve Harper, short black hair tucked under a cap, wearing a communications headset. Eve had grown up in rural Oregon and joined the FBI after a stint in Army intelligence. Her no-nonsense tone matched Thatcher's calm but unflinching approach. On Wyatt's lap rested the Jeep's tablet showing Duke's location. The German Shepherd rode in the lead vehicle with an FBI handler. His bandaged leg nearly healed, but still bore a fresh canine vest with a discreet bureau patch. A small camera clipped to his collar fed images to the tablet. The dog sat upright, ears swiveling, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Colt exhaled breath, fogging the SUV's interior. "We're sure Boone will be there?" he asked. Thatcher nodded once. "Warehouse manifests, SIM card pings, and our moles chatter. All say tonight is their big move. Kane Miller's coming in person." May looked over her shoulder. "And the kids?" Her voice tightened. Thatcher's eyes flicked to her. "We believe they're being used as couriers. Our priority is extraction before bullets fly." The convoy reached the last bend before the warehouse, a hulking structure of corrugated steel and cracked windows at the edge of the rail spur. Snow swirled across its roof, glinting in the floodlights the Iron Hawks had rigged. Wyatt squinted through the windshield, reading angles, counting guard posts. "They're sloppy tonight," he murmured. Overconfident. Inside the lead vehicle, Duke's nose pressed to the cracked window, breath fogging the glass. He whined once, pawing at the door. On Wyatt's tablet, a blinking icon appeared. Explosive scent detected. "He's picked up something," Wyatt said sharply. Thatcher raised his voice into the mic. "Confirm possible IEDs. Proceed slow." The Bureau's tactical team fanned out in silence, snow crunching under their boots. Wyatt, Colt, and May exited the SUV, pulling hoods low, while Thatcher moved like a shadow beside them. In the lead, Duke guided the FBI handler toward a side entrance body, taut but controlled. His nose moved from crate to crate, finally stopping at a stacked pallet near the door. He pawed once and backed up, ears stiff. Wyatt leaned in a crude tripwire rigged to a propane tank. "Booby trap," he whispered. "If he hadn't marked it, we'd be gone." Thatcher signaled 2 agents forward. They clipped the wire and neutralized the trap. "Good boy." Colt breathed into his mic, watching Duke on the feed. Duke's tail flicked once, but he did not break his stance. At Thatcher's signal, the team breached the warehouse. The door swung inward, and agents flooded in, weapons raised. Inside, rows of crates stacked like walls formed a maze under harsh fluorescent lights. The air reeked of chemical solvents and diesel. Near the far corner, a group of frightened children, no older than 12, huddled under a tarp, each carrying a small duffel bag. Jed Polk, tall and gaunt with a jagged scar across his chin, turned at the sound of boots. He wore a black parka and combat boots, the Red Hawk tattoo curling down his neck. Beside him, Lieutenant Silas Boone still wore his Timberline PD jacket badge, glinting under the warehouse lights. His expression was cold, the long smile gone. Police Doyle barked, stepping into the open. "Drop your weapons and step away from the children." Jed raised a pistol, but before he could aim, a flashbang rolled under the crate stack, exploding in a burst of light and sound. Agents surged forward. Boone tried to pull a child in front of him, but Duke emerged from the shadows like a storm. The German Shepherd leapt across a fallen crate, his limp barely noticeable, and clamped onto Boone's arm. The lieutenant screamed, dropping his weapon. Colt ran past them to the children kneeling low, voice calm. "You're safe now," he said. "Follow me." May guided them toward an exit while agents covered them. Wyatt vaulted a low barrier and tackled one of Jed's lieutenants who had been trying to flank the team. Doyle advanced on Jed himself, weapon steady, voice steel. "It's over, Polk." Jed swung the pistol, but an FBI sniper from the catwalk fired, striking it from his hand. Jed fell to his knees, hands up the fight draining from his eyes. Within minutes, the warehouse was secured. Agents moved through the maze of crates cataloging evidence guns, narcotics, forged documents. Boone lay cuffed and bleeding on the floor, his Timberline badge dangling like tarnished metal. Duke stood over him, panting hard, but steady eyes never leaving his former enemy. Colt knelt beside his partner, slipping a hand under the dog's chin. "You did it, boy," he murmured. Duke licked his glove, once tail thumping weakly. May guided the last of the children out, wrapping blankets around their shoulders. Wyatt stood near the door, scanning the emptying warehouse, the old soldier in him recognizing the moment when a battle's noise turns to aftermath silence. By sunrise, the Bureau had transported Jed Boone and the children safely out. Back at Timberline PD, Colt stood in a clean uniform, bruises fading but posture straight. An honor guard presented him with a formal commendation, restoring his standing and acknowledging his undercover work. Cameras clicked, but Colt's eyes sought only Duke, who sat beside May, wearing a new K9 vest. Later that week, the four of them gathered on the cabin's porch as dawn spilled over the snow-laden hills. Wyatt leaned on the railing, a mug of coffee in hand, storm-gray eyes softer now. Colt stood with one arm in a sling, a faint smile tugging at his lips. May wore a thick wool sweater and jeans, hair braided over one shoulder, a folder of rescue center plans tucked under her arm. Duke sat proudly at their feet, sunlight catching the polished metal of his new honorary K9 badge, etched with the words, "Service, Loyalty, Honor." Colt reached down to scratch behind Duke's ear. "We made it," he said softly. Wyatt nodded. "And the town will too." May smiled, glancing toward the ridge where she planned to build her official rescue center with new government funding. Sometimes she said it takes the worst kind of storm to clear the air. The four of them stood together, watching the sun climb higher. Timberline spread below them, quiet, in snowbound peace, no longer shadowed by fear. In that moment, they understood they had written a story not just of survival, but of redemption. One that bound a soldier, a cop, a volunteer, and a dog in a single arc of loyalty and hope. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with trumpets or lightning, but in quiet acts of courage and fidelity. A soldier, an officer, a volunteer, and a dog had stood together against darkness and found redemption. Just as God guided Wyatt to discover Colt and Duke in the frozen woods, He can guide each of us to moments where we are called to help protect or forgive. In everyday life, we may not face dangerous cartels, but we all encounter fear, loneliness, and injustice. When we choose compassion and courage, we invite grace into our homes and hearts. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories about loyalty, faith, and second chances. Type Amen in the comments if you believe God can still send miracles in unexpected forms, and may the Lord bless and protect every person watching.